Is Russia quietly taking over Africa while we focus on other headlines? In the past year alone, Russian influence in Africa has doubled. Is this the beginning of a new era? After analyzing dozens of sources, I've uncovered the hidden reasons behind Russia's growing influence in Africa, and trust me, the truth is more complex than it seems. As tensions rise between Russia and the United States, we're witnessing a surprising realignment on the continent of Africa, with many African nations leaning towards Moscow and raising Russian flags in protest against Western policies. Let's dive into how this shift is occurring and what it means for the future of Africa. Russia's increasing involvement in Africa is part of a broader strategy to establish a multipolar world, reducing Western dominance in global affairs. The ongoing Cold War-like tensions between Russia and the U.S. are evident as African nations navigate their foreign relations, often feeling caught between these two powers. The rise of anti-Western sentiment in some African countries has opened doors for Russia to position itself as the most favorable alternative. To know who is actually winning or losing the battle, we will delve into some key factors. Military cooperation. One of the most visible aspects of Russia's influence in Africa is its military cooperation with various governments. Russia has positioned itself as a key security partner for several African nations. Countries such as the Central African Republic, Caire, Mali, and Burkina Faso have turned to Russia for military support, often showing dissatisfaction with Western interventions. The Wagner Group, a private military contractor linked to the Kremlin, has been deployed in many African nations. Their presence is often associated with training local forces, providing security for government officials, and engaging in combat against insurgents. This arrangement allows African governments to reinforce their military capabilities without the political control often attached to Western aid. While this military support can stabilize governments, it also sparks concerns about human rights violations and the long-term implications for governance in these countries. Economic ties. Russia is currently expanding its economic influence in Africa, particularly in sectors rich in natural resources. African countries are very rich in minerals, oil, and gas, and Russia is keen to tap into these resources. For example, Russian companies have signed agreements in the Caire and Zimbabwe to exploit gold and diamond resources. Russia has been establishing trade agreements that are in favor of its economic interests. These agreements often come with fewer conditions unlike those imposed by Western nations, making them more attractive to African leaders. Russia is also investing in infrastructure projects, such as energy and transportation. This will not only help local economies, but also strengthens Russia's foothold on the continent. Diplomatic influence. Russia is leveraging its diplomatic relationships to gain support and legitimacy in Africa. At the United Nations, Russia has been actively courting African nations to support its positions, particularly regarding the Ukraine conflict. Many African countries have abstained from condemning Russia's actions, and this reflects a growing reluctance to align with Western narratives. Russia is employing disinformation tactics to weaken Western influence and promote its narrative. This includes social media campaigns that exploit local grievances against Western powers, depicting Russia as a more reliable partner. Russia is also engaging in cultural diplomacy, promoting Russian language and culture through educational programs and exchanges, further strengthening its ties with African nations. Growing acceptance. The shifting political landscape in Africa is leading to a growing acceptance of Russian influence. Many African nations have expressed dissatisfaction with Western interventions, which they see as neo-colonial. The failures of past Western-led initiatives, particularly in terms of promoting democracy and human rights, have led some countries to look for alternatives. The rise of military juntas in countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso reflects a broader trend of rejecting Western influence. These governments often prioritize stability over democratic governance and view Russia as a partner that respects their sovereignty. Russia's policy of non-interference in domestic affairs is appealing to many African leaders. This approach contrasts sharply with the West's emphasis on human rights and democratic reforms, making Russia a more attractive ally for governments seeking to maintain control. Cultural and historical resonance. To understand Russia's appeal, we must journey back in time. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union positioned itself as a champion of liberation movements in Africa. From supporting anti-colonial fighters to providing military aid and education, Russia was seen as a friend in the struggle for independence. Many African leaders and communities remember this support fondly, seeing Russia as a partner that stood against Western imperialism when it mattered most. Fast forward to today, and this historical context is being revived. As African nations struggle with the legacies of colonialism, the narrative of resistance against Western dominance resonates more than ever. Russia has skillfully tapped into this sentiment, presenting itself as a steadfast ally in the fight for sovereignty and self-determination. For decades, the Soviet Union was viewed as a supporter of liberation movements across Africa, providing assistance and solidarity to those fighting against colonial rule. This legacy has not been forgotten. In the eyes of many African leaders and citizens, Russia's historical stance as a non-colonial power, joined with its support for anti-colonial struggles, positions it as a champion of African interests. Today, Russia is actively promoting itself as an anti-imperialist force, a narrative that echoes deeply with a continent still struggling with the legacies of colonialism. High-profile visits by Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, are strategically designed to reinforce this image. During these visits, Russia emphasizes its past contributions to African liberation, painting itself as a steadfast ally against Western dominance. This portrayal is particularly appealing in a climate where many African nations are increasingly questioning their relationships with Western powers, seeking alternatives that align more closely with their aspirations for sovereignty and self-determination. By invoking historical ties and shared struggles, Russia is not only nurturing goodwill, but also building strategic alliances across Africa.